Welcome to Beyond the Hype, the podcast where we cut through the buzzwords and bold claims to uncover how science really works. I'm Professor Frank Marino, physiologist, researcher, and someone who's spent a career asking hard questions about the science of performance, fatigue, and the human limits. Each episode will dig into the evidence behind the latest trends in sport, health, and wellness. What holds up under scrutiny and what's just hype. Join me as we go beyond the headlines, beyond the fads, and beyond the hype. Have you ever stepped into the ocean on a winter's morning? That sharp gasp of breath as the cold grips your chest, the pins and needles racing across your skin, the way your body almost resists before it finally gives in. Or maybe you've turned the shower dial too far too cold and felt that instant jolt, a shock that's both uncomfortable and strangely invigorating. In that moment, you're wide awake, your nervous system is in overdrive. Cold water has that effect. It shocks us, it challenges us, it makes us feel alive. But does it actually make us perform better or recover faster? Or for that matter, cure chronic ailments and put us on a path to better health? The story of endurance begins not with Olympians or sports science labs, but with a lone runner on a dusty Greek road. The legend tells us that Phidippides, the Athenian messenger, ran from the battlefield at Marathon to Athens to deliver the news of victory. Try and imagine him staggering into the city, sunburnt and spent. He uttered just one word, "Nikomen, we have won," before collapsing, never to rise again. Now, whether the details are myth or fact doesn't actually matter. When I first came across the legend of Phidippides, what struck me was this: why did he collapse only after delivering the message? That detail has always seemed very curious to me. And maybe you've noticed something similar in real life. At major races, the majority of runners who collapse don't do it mid-race. It actually happens right after they cross the finish line. In fact, studies show that about 85% of runners who collapse do so once the effort is over. Now, the usual explanation is heat exhaustion, that something has gone catastrophically wrong. But if that's really the case, why does it so often happen after the race and not during it? Back to Phidippides. His story captures something deeply human. When the body overheats, when every protective mechanism is pushed to the limit, fatigue can become catastrophic. Fast forward more than 2,000 years, and athletes are still wrestling with the same problem. Heat remains one of the greatest enemies of performance. Muscles may have the capacity, but the body temperature rises, the brain steps in to slow us down, sometimes to protect us, and sometimes in spite of us. And the evidence is clear. In 2004, I published data looking at every Olympic marathon from the very first in 1896 up to the Sydney Games in 2000. What we found was striking. If the environmental temperature during that event was below 25 degrees Celsius, around 80% of the runners actually finished. But if the temperature was above 25 degrees, that number dropped sharply. Just over half of the runners made it to the end. Even more telling, world records for distance events from about 3,000 metres all the way up to the marathon are almost never set unless the temperature is cool, no more than about 14 degrees Celsius. The pattern was clear. Heat was the silent limiter. And so the question became, could we find a way to start cooler, to buy the body more time before it reached that breaking point? That's the idea behind precooling. Unlike Phidippides though, modern athletes aren't helpless. We've learned ways to trick physiology, to lower body temperature before the starting gun even fires. This is the idea of precooling. From ice vests worn by cyclists at the Olympic Games to immersion in cold water before competing in hot environments, science has been probing how cooling strategies can extend endurance, preserve power, and in some cases prevent the collapse that felled that ancient runner. And then, of course, there's the other side of the story. What happens after performance? If you paid attention, in recent decades, cold water immersion has become one of the most hyped recovery tools in sport and now health. But what does the evidence actually say? Is it performance-saving science? Can it really boost our longevity and make our chronic ailments vanish? Or is this just another myth in the dustbin of fads? In this episode of Beyond the Hype, we'll take a journey from the battlefield of marathon to the modern sports lab, unpacking the history, the science and the hype around cold water immersion and pre-cooling. So, let's take the plunge. In the first episode, we talked about how science really works, that it's not about proving things true, but about testing and challenging them. We explored how fads like snake oil or oxygenated water often get ahead of the evidence, and how the burden of science is always to be skeptical, to ask, does it really work? Cold water immersion is a perfect example of that tension between tradition, science, and hype. So, today in part one, we're going to look at the roots of cold exposure and how it became a scientific tool called pre-cooling. And then, in part two, we'll turn to how it became the recovery craze you see everywhere today. The idea of plunging into cold water is not some 21st century biohack. Ancient civilizations understood the invigorating effects of water. The Romans built elaborate bathhouses, not only with hot pools but also with cold ones, where part of the ritual was to move between extremes of temperature. In 1702, the English physician Sir John Floyer published one of the first books on cold bathing. He argued that cold water could treat a range of ailments, and his work sparked a revival of hydrotherapy across Europe. In the 19th century, figures like Vincenz Presnitz in Austria and Sebastian Nipp in Germany made cold baths central to their naturopathic regimes. Patients were prescribed icy plunges, cold showers, even barefoot walks in the snow. Scotch douches, basically high-pressure cold showers and water sprays, were treatments for everything from tuberculosis to depression. Even the modern shower, which we take for granted today, was partly born out of this hydrotherapy movement. In the late 19th century, French physician François-Marie Delbour installed communal cold rain baths in prisons as a more efficient and hygienic alternative to bathing. The idea spread, and by the mid-20th century, showers were becoming commonplace in Western homes. But in those early decades, the association with invigoration and discipline through cold water was pretty strong. Across the world, humans have also embraced cold water out of necessity or tradition. In fact, during my own doctoral studies, which were on the psychophysiology of cold stress, I learned about the famous Korean diving women. The Haenyeo, or sea women of Jeju Island, have for centuries dived into frigid seas without wetsuits, harvesting shellfish for hours on end. Their resilience and ability to adapt to cold exposure is absolutely extraordinary. Similar practices exist in Japan, with the Amma divers, and in Scandinavia, where winter swimming and plunging into icy lakes after sauna are part of cultural identity. In Russia, cold river dips have been long associated with both religion and health. These traditions remind us that cold water immersion is not new, it's deeply human. So the question, however, is whether these practices actually translate into scientific benefits for performance or recovery, or for overall wellness and health. So that's a little bit of history of where cold water immersion might have originated and how it's perpetuated through different cultures. But let's return to the athlete's problem. By the second half of the 20th century, science was asking a different question. Not, does cold invigorate, but can cold help performance and health? Because the problem was always heat. And this wasn't just obvious to scientists in the lab. It was obvious to anyone watching athletes compete. I'm sure you've all been spectators, and you could see it. Heat either slowed things down or it stopped competitors in their tracks. We all know that feeling. When it's hot, everything feels harder and we naturally slow our pace. But the question is why? Well, the basic physiology is actually pretty straightforward. Think of the body as layers. On the outside, we have the shell, that's the skin. Underneath, we have the muscles. And deeper still, at the very centre, is the core, where the organs that keep us alive sit. And of course, that also includes the brain. What we learned from studies in the mid-1990s is that when your core body temperature, that is the temperature around your organs, rises beyond a certain point, you either slow down or you stop. Again and again, experiments showed the same pattern. Whether you were a highly trained athlete or just an ordinary individual, fatigue set in once core temperature reached about 39 to 39.5 degrees Celsius. For a while, this phenomenon was referred to as the critical limiting core temperature. Now, how quickly you reach that limit depends on a few things, like the intensity of exercise or how hard you're exercising, the environment, and even your body size. Bigger athletes tend to accumulate heat faster than smaller ones. And here's a fascinating side note. Of all the athletic groups studied over the past century, the one group whose body size hasn't really changed is the marathon runner. They're still typically small and slender, and that makes sense because the smaller you are, the less heat you accumulate. But size alone doesn't fully explain why heat is such a problem. The real issue is the brain. And the body gets hotter, the brain steps in to protect you. It slows you down by reducing the amount of muscle you can actually recruit. It's as if the brain is pulling some kind of emergency brake to prevent catastrophic overheating. So how do we accumulate heat in the first place? Here's where the basic physics comes in. Normally, the core temperature is tightly regulated. We recognise this and we typically call it the set point temperature, which is around 37 degrees Celsius. But really, it sits between 36.8 and 37.2 degrees Celsius. Skin temperature is usually a little lower, around 35 to 36. And the environment, if we're lucky, is cooler still. Let's say, for argument, 20 to 25 degrees. That gradient, core to skin to environment, is what allows us to offload the heat. As the core warms, heat moves out to the skin. The sweat evaporates, cooling the blood at the surface, and that cooler blood is returned to the core, which helps keep things stable. It's an elegant system. Until the environment tips the balance. When it's hot and humid, heat can't escape quickly enough because the sweat doesn't evaporate efficiently, and the core temperature climbs toward that limiting factor. And once it does, the body and the brain begin to slow things down to reduce the amount of heat you potentially accumulate. So the bottom line is this. If we can't offload the heat, the core temperature rises. Our endurance drops, and in extreme cases, athletes might collapse. History is full of examples. The infamous 1904 St. Louis Olympics, where the marathon runners staggered and collapsed in the heat. The 1968 Mexico City Olympics, where altitude and climate made conditions especially challenging, and countless football and soccer matches played in sweltering conditions. The physiological problem is very simple. Heat builds up faster than the body can dump it. The question became, could we give the body a head start by cooling it down before exercise? This was the birth of precooling. The idea was really straightforward. Lower the body temperature before competition, create a heat storage buffer, and delay the point where the rising core temperature impairs performance. In the 1980s and 1990s, researchers experimented with different methods, immersing athletes in cold water, wearing cooling vests, drinking ice slurries, even standing in front of misting fans. The goal was always the same: start cooler, last longer. Interestingly, before 1997, the only real attempt to study precooling in humans exposed to the heat dated back to 1961. Then, in 1997, using that model that was already published, we conducted and published one of the first modern studies using whole body cold water immersion before running in the heat. Athletes ran for 30 minutes after being pre-cooled, and the results were striking. On average, they covered an additional 304 metres compared with normal conditions. The reason was clear. Pre-cooling slowed the rate at which core temperature rose, buying them more time before hitting the limit. The following year, in 1998, we went further. With my colleagues, we outlined methods for applying cooling in a reproducible way. At the time, not all protocols were equal, so this was about creating scientific rigour and consistency in how pre-cooling was tested. That same year, in another study, we looked at repeated cold water immersions. Could regular exposure shift physiological responses in a lasting way? Could the body adapt? Together, these studies helped move cold exposure out of tradition and anecdote and into the realm of testable, measurable science. They showed not just that cold could work, but that how it was applied really did matter. But of course, science doesn't exist in isolation. It has to contend with habits, with rituals and long-held beliefs. One of the biggest challenges we faced with pre-cooling was convincing athletes to do the exact opposite of what they'd always been told, not to warm up. For generations, warming up was sacred. It was the first thing every coach insisted on, the ritual before every race, before every game, before you even picked up a racket. So when we asked athletes to sit in a cold bath before competing or to put on a cooling vest instead of jogging, it felt completely backwards. Many were sceptical. Some thought the cold would leave them stiff, sluggish, even at a disadvantage, and maybe produce an injury. What they didn't realise was that the real enemy wasn't the lack of warming up, it was the heat itself. Pre-cooling wasn't about skipping preparation, it was about buying time against the rise of core temperature, the ultimate enemy. This was a reminder that shifting a mindset or a paradigm is never easy, and it's one of the reasons science can feel slow. It's not just about running the experiments, it's about challenging deeply held beliefs, testing them, and showing that the results hold true again and again. Unfortunately, this takes time. But that's also why science matters. It forces us to question what we think we know. It takes ideas that sound strange, even counterintuitive, like cooling down before you heat up, and asks, does it actually work? And that's an important lesson. Pre-cooling was a perfect example of challenging dogma and long-held beliefs for something that now had evidence. By the 2000s, pre-cooling wasn't just a laboratory curiosity. It was being used in the field. In 2008, along with researchers at the Australian Institute of Sport, we published a study on practical pre-cooling for cycling, showing that wearing cooling vests before a time trial in warm conditions actually improved performance. This was important because it moved pre-cooling out of the lab and into the form of athletes could realistically use. The reality is that it gave our Australian athletes an edge. These methods were adopted at the highest level. At the Olympic Games, for example, the cyclists used cooling jackets and vests in the staging areas before competition to offset the effects of the heat. So this wasn't about traditional wellness. It was a deliberate, scientifically grounded attempt to manage physiology under extreme conditions. But, as is often the case, the story was not so simple. Pre-cooling showed a lot of promise, especially in laboratories. It worked best in hot, humid environments, for endurance-type activity and in athletes who had the time and means to do it properly. But there were also challenges. It was logistically demanding, uncomfortable for many, and not always feasible in the real-world competition. The benefits were also not universal. They depended on the athlete, the climate, and the sport. It was also the case that pre-cooling manoeuvres had, by its very nature, a limiting effect. The reality is its capability was only good for about 30 to 40 minutes. And if you wanted more, you would have to stop and cool down again. Its practicality was limited. In other words, precooling was a tool, not a magic bullet. And that's an important distinction because when science makes that distinction, hype, unfortunately, often ignores it. That's where we'll leave it for part 1. We've seen that cold water immersion is far from a new idea. From Roman baths to 19th century hydrotherapy, from Korean diving women to my own work on precooling in the 90s, cold water has always fascinated us. In the modern era, studies have shown how precooling could be made practical, and we saw Olympic athletes adopting cooling jackets as part of their preparation. But here's the crucial point. In science, potential is not the same as proof, and a useful tool in one setting doesn't automatically become a cure-all everywhere else. Precooling was never meant to be a universal solution. It was context-dependent, sometimes practical, sometimes not. In part 2, we'll follow the story into the change rooms and training grounds and ask, how did this niche laboratory practice transform into one of the most popular recovery strategies in sport, and then into a wellness craze for the general public? And more importantly, does the evidence actually stack up? So join me next time as we take the plunge into the icy world of recovery and find out whether cold water is truly a performance-saving science, or is it just cold comfort? I'm Professor Frank Marino, and this is Beyond the Hype, and I'll see you in part 2.